Very good morning to you. It's such an honor and a pleasure for us to host a very distinguished delegation from South Africa, led by our friend of India, our distinguished High Commissioner. I'm also particularly delighted that this lecture is happening today because our professor's interest is in the field of literature more broadly, but I understand he's going to speak about something that I deeply care about the concept of Ubuntu. Sense of collective consciousness that we need to build as humanity to engage with each other, but also to be concerned about the other. So I'm really grateful to our distinguished professor, but also the members of the diplomatic community in the South African Office of the High Commissioner here in Delhi. I will unfortunately miss this lecture, but I'm glad that we are recording it. I want to leave this thought with you that one of the things that as a university we are trying to do is to build a stronger relationship with Africa, but specifically South Africa. And I hope that the discussion that we're having today with our friends from South Africa will help us in building a deeper and a more pervasive relationship with the South African institutions and universities. The visit of this delegation today will mark and herald a new beginning for us to more substantively engage with South Africa. It's a country that is deeply connected to our own history. Mahatma Gandhi's freedom struggle in India happened, or rather began, in South Africa. His experience at the Pietermaritzburg railway station continues to inspire generations of people's struggles against colonialism, other forms of discrimination. And so, in a way, we have a different type of emotional relationship with South Africa. As I told our High Commissioner and our friends, that unfortunately, over the years, this relationship has been seen purely from sort of a trade and investment and more commercial relationship between countries, which I can understand the terrain in which diplomats function, and that obviously becomes a priority. But it is important that as universities, thinking individuals, young people in both our countries have a larger role and responsibility to play. Universities and institutions have a bigger responsibility to play. So I am particularly delighted that the Jindal School of International Affairs is able to host our delegation from South Africa at our university. So with that, I now call upon Dr. Sriram Chaulia, the Dean of the School of International Affairs, to take the proceedings forward. As I said, I'll be missing this, but enjoy the rest of the proceedings.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor. Good morning to everyone. Special welcome to Her Excellency, the High Commissioner of South Africa to India, and to other diplomats from the High Commission of South Africa, and special welcome, of course, to our keynote speaker today, Professor Nkondo, who is a big African intellectual, and it's really an honor for us at this university to be hosting him for our students to learn from a visionary thinker. His bio has been circulated on campus, and we all know his various academic as well as intellectual accomplishments. But one of the things that we would be keen to hear from him is the role of moral and spiritual values in connecting societies. This class, by the way, the bulk of the audience, sir, are students learning about warfare and international security. So this Professor Pankaj Jha, my colleague, has worked in India's National Security Council for many years, and he's actually a defense and military affairs specialist. So we thought it would be most appropriate to bring you to a class like this so that they can also think about non-materialistic factors in international relations. We all know the history of the South-South cooperation began on non-materialistic basis, right? And Her Excellency, the High Commissioner, has been promoting a series of events in India. Ma'am, our students also went to the RIS hosted event recently on Mandela and Gandhi. So 150 years of Mahatma Gandhi, 100 years of Mandela, there's a huge year-long series of events and celebrations going on. So all the more important for us to reinforce these values and to think about non-materialistic or even quote-unquote non-rational bases on which societies and countries have come together and cooperated. You know, these days we often hear that for any cause or for any kind of movement to happen, you need donors and you need a whole machinery to make people work for it. And that's how things happen in today's world, they say, for any cause. But you go back to just 60, 70 years ago, when the liberation struggles were going on in our respective societies, people actually sacrificed their whole lives for freedom and built linkages across the high seas and across continents on the basis of this solidarity, which did not require any donors or any financial conveners to make it happen. So that spirit needs to be rekindled, and we in India strongly believe that the future, when we say it's going to belong to the global south, there has to be something other than transactional values based on give and take, which is commercial, as the Vice Chancellor was saying, or geopolitical or geostrategic. So there is a softer glue that binds us historically, but sometimes we forget it. Sometimes we simply say, okay, what are you going to give me, and if I do this in return, how will I benefit in a very tangible way? From the US president downwards, now the milieu has become such that everything is transactional, right? But I think today we are really fortunate to have Professor Nkondo, because I hope he will be able to shine light on the spiritual and ideational constructs. Most of the big Pan-African thinkers always believed that the continental unity of Africa transcends the geographical Africa and goes to extends to all the oppressed people around the world. So it's a liberation philosophy, one which is based, and you might ask, what is the liberation today? We've all got independence. We have driven out our colonial masters. South Africa was one of the last ones, 1994, to gain independence. But what's the cause today? Well, I think I will request Professor Nkondo to reflect on it, because a lot of young people, sir, believe that there is no struggle anymore and that they simply need to pursue their individual self-interests and that there's no big issue left to fight for and to sacrifice for. Our own Prime Minister says, that our forefathers fought for freedom and gave their lives for it, but we need to at least live for the country and for the world, if not die for it. So there is an attempt to bring back these big principles and values into public life, although it's a challenge, but I hope we will be inspired by Professor Nkondo today. So over to you, sir. We request you to kindly address our students and inspire them. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, sir. Are you using the...
Well, thanks very much for making space for me and my colleagues, in what we call the Rishaka Forum in South Africa. But before I kick off, let me just thank your Vice Chancellor here for a very comprehensive...
Sir, you could use this as well.
Yeah.
Hold it closer.
Sorry. I thought I should start off by thanking your Vice Chancellor here for giving us a very quick overview of the history and the origins and the future of this university. Thanks very much for that. It was really a very, very generous reading of the state of higher education in the world. I think it was very good. I also want to thank my own High Commissioner here for negotiating this space, before us. I'm here with my senior colleague here, Mr. Kosa, who's very key. He's our strategist. And, okay.
Hold it closer.
Yeah, this one's better. I was just saying that I want to thank our High Commissioner here for making the space, with your Vice Chancellor, for me and my colleagues in the forum. I've prepared a fairly comprehensive statement on the politics of Ubuntu and Satyagraha, but it's so comprehensive and full of citations and references that I don't think it will be proper for me to read it here. But I'll give it to my High Commissioner, and she will distribute it in due time. For now, I'll just give you a quick executive summary of the major ideas that shape. I've decided to couch my topic in this way: resonance between the concept of a shared future for humankind and the philosophies of Ubuntu and Satyagraha in international relations. What are our objectives and vision? Rishaka in South Africa, the word Rishaka in South Africa is a Tsonga Shangan equivalent for what we call in English cultural community. That's what Rishaka means in my language. Tsonga Shangan is one of the 11 official languages in South Africa. Okay. We stayed with the African name because, like all idioms and metaphors, it's not quite translatable into a foreign language. But I think this captures vaguely what we mean by Rishaka, a cultural community distinct with its own origins and its own histories. Launched in 2016, its objective is to focus deliberation and interdisciplinary research on culture as a force for democracy within South Africa, as well as conflict resolution and peace in diplomacy and international relations. That's the major thrust of our mission and vision. The different programs of our forum are as follows, just briefly, the major programs that shape our work. First, cultural diversity as a force for social cohesion, for inclusive growth, and for sustainable development in South Africa. If you read almost all our policies in Africa, their key outcomes are those three: inclusive, social cohesion, inclusive growth, and sustainable development. They shape every policy, whether it is health, water, public works. They drive our thinking in policy work. In Africa, it provides a platform for debate and evidence-based research on regional integration and Pan-African unity. If you look at the foundation documents of the OAU and the AU, they turn almost always on these principles. In the world, we seek to provide a platform for cross-country deliberation and research on the possibilities of peace among nations, very much in keeping with the substance and spirit of the United Nations Peace Summit in honor of Nelson Mandela, in keeping also with the meaning of Nelson Mandela International Day. Those two moments capture both the substance and the spirit of our vision and our mission as a forum. In this regard, Rishaka Forum works very much in the tradition of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., Satyagraha, and global peace. In all these programs, culture, language, ethics, religion, politics, economics, and knowledge are fused into an integrated framework for policy, for strategy, for institutional arrangements, for rules and regulations, including codes of behavior in public office. Quite a tall order, but that's the direction in which we're trying to move, and to mobilize research across countries on these issues. Conscious of the primacy of the sovereignty of the people over and above the sovereignty of the state, Rishaka Forum seeks to stimulate deliberation and research on people-to-people relations as a necessary condition for interstate relations and diplomacy. Just immediately after the Second World War, there were interstate structures across the world, focusing mainly on the sovereignty of the state. But in Africa, we have learned that sovereignty of the state is not enough. So we have moved from the sovereignty of the state to sovereignty of the people. And in the scholarship, as you know, there's a movement away from governance to the politics of culture worldwide. There are many secular and religious traditions in the world from which we draw our governance principles in our forum. But for this occasion, we touch upon and can do no better than touch upon Ubuntu and Satyagraha as transformative ethical systems in a world of differences. Slavery, imperialism and colonialism, Nazism, apartheid, religious wars, fundamentalism and terrorism, the Cold War, gender violence, the globalization of exploitative economic forms. Rishaka Forum seeks to promote deliberation within South Africa and across nations, as well as research on the possibilities of difference in all its forms as a place of possibilities, as a place of opportunity for self-understanding and mutual recognition. And that way move public discourse, both national and international, from oppositional to complementary difference. It's important. Growing up under apartheid, we were taught that, that if you find somebody different, if you're African, you find somebody Indian, or somebody Jewish, or what we call white and black, whatever that means, that person is a problem. So the next person, as Jean-Paul Sartre said, is no exit, the closing of doors for you. That's a kind of negative identity formation that we have been, how our collective subjectivities have been constructed under apartheid. So we are moving away as a forum from oppositional difference to complementary difference, where to be Indian as an African is to provide a place for an opening, for newness, for fresh possibilities. The movement in political consciousness from oppositional to complementary difference, very much aware of the contingency of identity, the contingency of the self, the contingency of language, and the contingency of community, the contingency of the thing we call the nation, provides an ethos for international relations and diplomacy. Look very carefully. The more the major tensions in interstate politics, whether it's Nazism, or Marxism, or whatever you do, or even gender politics, difference is a negative counterforce against harmony and peace. But then, like good students, as Socrates, advised us, before you try to provide answers, try hard to ask the right questions. And here are the questions that stumblingly we came across that guide our thinking about policy. The first question: how can the South African and Indian governments foster the development of Ubuntu and Satyagraha as public policy in their social, economic, cultural, and political relations? That is the first question. Is a fundamental question. Deal profound and comprehensively with the politics of identity in all its forms. 2, how can enterprises such as universities, schools, hospitals, businesses, courts, and trade be founded on Ubuntu and Satyagraha principles? I have a son who's doing his PhD and always tells me that there's no ethics in business. They forget ethics. Let us talk about the logic of capital. But I'm saying to my son, the world is more complex than that. How can our two governments and their social partners work together on the Ubuntu, on the United Nations Global Peace Program, sharing responsibilities, encouraging each other in the integration of Ubuntu and Satyagraha in public policies and promoting the common good? If you listen to some heads of very powerful states in the world today, they are after national interests. It's me first and you later. I work with you to exploit you for the sake of my national interest. That is the trajectory now in world politics. Are there practical ways in which Ubuntu and Satyagraha can become central to national development plans and diplomacy. Machiavelli will say, oh, you are too naive. There's no way interrelations can be considered around ethics. You are just too naive. But I think there is the way it goes. Reasons of state are no longer enough. So I think we must move towards a much more global, a much more cordial politics to drive our relationships. As we seek to sharpen debate and research on India-South Africa relations, how can we dissolve the categories one of us and not one of us into all of us, grounded in mutual recognition and a sense of a shared humanity? Look at how our subjectivities, whether you are Indian, Chinese, Russian, South African, Brazilian, almost all the civilizations to date, shape the way we relate to each other in terms of two categories. Are you one of us? If you're one of us, you deserve my sympathy. You have claim to my obligation. But if you're not one of us, you have no claim to my obligation. You have no claim to my sympathy, to my pity. That's what the horror and the tragedy of apartheid, the horror and the tragedy of Nazi, the horror and the tragedy of the slave experience. And it continues, the ethnic cleansing in Eastern Europe. That is the anthropology behind it. In what ways can our secular and religious traditions, Hinduism, Christianity, Buddhism, Confucianism, African faith systems, liberalism, Islam, and so on, deepen our understanding of difference, what Jacques Derrida called the difference, as a creative force? How can we? If you think of the major thinking, particularly in Europe, France, the whole movement around the deconstruction is to find creative ways of dealing with difference, with being different in so many forms. You remember that Foucault once said to us in Paris, said, look, you say this one is disabled, this one is a cripple, this one is mad. You remember his book, Madness and Civilization? He says, no. What do you think might be a cripple? Maybe a different way of being human. What do you think is a mad person? It might be a different way of being human. He says, in the history of madness in France, the people who were regarded as mad in the 10th century were regarded as very sane in the 20th. Those who were sane in the 5th century were regarded as mad now. That history of madness is the history of identities and how subjectivities are falsely constructed and distort even international relations. Policy in the forum, we found out, is an ambition, is an aspiration. But in South Africa, as almost everywhere in the post-colonies, there's a tension between policy and its implementation. Almost a predictable disjuncture between what we say we are going to do for the people and what we actually do. Given this predicament, and that predicament is universal now, why do governments find it very difficult to complement policies meant for fundamental change? I was listening to a TV last night. There's that concern. Government says, do ABC, it hasn't done it. It sounds so familiar, so vernacular to me as a South African. Why is this almost a universal predicament, particularly in neoliberal democracies? Why is it? Why is poverty so persistent, so stubborn in both South Africa and India? Why are exploitative forces so resilient? Why are they so adaptive? In what ways can we use our regional constellations, our BRICS, our IPSA, our Southern think tanks, our South-South corporations, to mobilize governments, civil society organizations, and the private sector in the common pursuit of justice? There's a tendency to think it's the responsibility of government, of the state. But this is too complex for the state. Civil society must participate. I think it's wrong to think that the state can do all this. But then, what are the relative obligations of the state, of the market, and of the people? I hope by the end of this occasion, you will tell me what in India, who are the people? When you say the people, who really are the people in India? Anyway. Before we select the most appropriate instruments for social cohesion, for regional integration, and for world peace in international relations, we need to identify the sources and the forms of resistance to fundamental change. First, these to us are the obstacles to Ubuntu, the obstacles to Satyagraha in modern societies. First, effects of the corporate system on culture, on values and outlooks, on ways of life, on African and Indian social imaginaries. That is a major challenge to any kind of moral imagination in the world. Second, by incorporation is meant a more general process of change, the reorganization of perceptions as well as of enterprise and institutions, not only the expansion of an industrial capitalist system across South Africa and India, not only tightening systems of transport and communication, the speed of a market economy, the spread of a market economy into all regions of South African and Indian societies, but also and even predominantly the remaking of cultural perceptions this process entailed. In the 50s and the 60s, this became so intense in South Africa that we developed what we call the Black Consciousness Movement to deepen our understanding of how we see the world and how the world sees us. A related concern is individualism, and I know that you have your own preoccupation around this issue. Individualism has led to the primacy of instrumental reason, what I call the egotistical perception. Unless I can use you to further my interest, you are no good to me. That is the instrumental reason. Also, a lot of you have read Immanuel Kant will know this, and that's the way. Human interests now are driven by instrumental reason. individualism has led to the primacy of instrumental reason over and above what I call the empathic imagination. And individualism, certainly in South Africa, appears as a diffuse cynicism at all levels of our society. We have to find what buttons to push in our cynical consciousness to get the struggle for the full meaning of freedom and justice going. There are deep-seated psychic problems here that we have to overcome. Now, cynicism in most post-colonies presents itself as that state of consciousness that has followed after strident nationalism and patriotism. There's a story about the Congo after independence. There was so much excitement in the Congo, you know. Meetings every day, meetings about meetings, meetings to convene other meetings. There's such a bustle in the whole country. And there's the story that says, people got tired of it. They said, when is this Uhuru going away? They got tired of it. This cynicism is accompanied by a decline in public trust and confidence. And that runs through most of the post-colonies, including India. This is bolstered by a decline of moral obligation in public life. There is also the problem of globalization and its threat to the sovereignty of the people, particularly in poor countries. Poor people in South Africa are losing control of the state apparatus because of very coercive global forces. But there are also, colleagues, opportunities in the surge of democratic struggles in South Africa and India. The land expropriation without compensation movement in South Africa and the Me Too movement in India point to profound transformative energies in our societies. There's hope there. The people haven't, despaired yet. In addition, in South Africa, there is broad consensus, fortunately, on building a democratic state with the capability to mobilize and manage inclusive growth and sustainability. If you read our National Development Plan, there's whole energy there. We've all agreed we must build a development state that has enough capability to manage our policies. In this cosmic context, what is the advantage of Ubuntu and Satyagraha in this global context? So many years after the demise of the Cold War, what is that? Why are we focusing on these true value systems? The key elements of Ubuntu and Satyagraha as public policies, in national and international relations, so far, are that they embody as a principle not only the freedom of individuals, but moral responsibility and obligation, the first one. The second virtue, they make public reasoning the arbiter of moral judgment, not just votes, public reasoning as the arbiter of judgment. elections haven't solved our problems. They are organic in the sense that their working procedures are subject to change and adaptation. And finally, they are participative and deliberative in ensuring that all of their members have a right to a vote. Deliberation in an Ubuntu and Satyagraha circle of national and international environment plays a central role in the development of a community of shared values, because it requires participation in another's place in order to know how to communicate to others. What happens now with Satyagraha, with Ubuntu, that you are enabled to occupy another person's space, to be able to penetrate and enter into states of being other than your own. That imagination, which the market forces don't encourage. The ritualization of speaking and writing through shared deliberation can be seen as part of an interactive process that creates a linguistic and moral relationship, and the blending of the self and the other into an interstate community. There is the genius of Satyagraha and Ubuntu, helped mainly by the creative arts, but of that later. Learning how to speak to others and to listen, as well as to write and to read across differences, as well as to listen across differences. And the conventions of deliberation, both of speech and writing, are central to the successful functions of an Ubuntu and Satyagraha international community. I'm told that you guys here are very strong in the humanities. Let's begin to study very carefully the dynamics of listening to somebody, particularly listening to somebody who disagrees with you. The political psychology involved there, and how we can manage the hermeneutics involved there. Negotiating the intricate relationship between Ubuntu and Satyagraha and action. So far, our theories, our paradigms, our models fail to be translated into action. And our people are getting impatient with us as scholars, intellectuals. When are you going to translate these profound ideas into real action? I want food at the end of the day. I want to be able to pay for my kids' education. I want ABCD now. Stop theorizing. Stop coming back to us with theories about other theories, manifestos about other manifestos. Real action in real time. There's the challenge of Ubuntu and Satyagraha. And here are the guiding questions about this complex problem. Why has it been so difficult for our government to translate ethics into political action? Why has it been so difficult in both South Africa and India to educate for feeling and for attitude and for behavior? We are very strong in both countries. We are very strong, in fact, throughout, in the Commonwealth, very strong in educating for technically exploitable skills and knowledge, but very weak in educating for sensibility, for imagination, for behavior. And that disjuncture, of course, now the scholarship in this country, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, about the increasing marketization of higher education. And in that way, it disorients and distorts the mandate of higher education. How can we, in our mutual effort to internationalize our educational system, master the science and the acts to augment the students' moral and empathic imagination? Your Vice Chancellor took us to a brilliant overview of the history of this university and the strength in the humanities. But how can we do this to make sure that we augment the student capacity, not just to think technically, not just how to produce more and better food, but how to penetrate and understand the state of being of the next person, particularly the one who is so different from you. In IPSA, how can we make practical use of Paulo Freire's pedagogies of the oppressed and hope? I'm sure you have read about Paulo Freire. Read two very interesting books, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed and The Pedagogy for Hope. Now that we are working very closely in IPSA with South Africa, India, and Brazil, we might want to go to school to Paulo Freire and find out what we can learn there. But these are, as I close, this is the preliminary response to these large questions. We should form South Africa, India communities of shared values in various disciplines and in various domains, and to explore practical ways in which such communities can shape and direct our business. And I'm trying to reduce humanities, to make humanities respond to workaday life, not just philosophy, not just that, but to boil it down to workaday life and make it respond to kitchen challenges. That is the challenge. As we do this, we should be sensitive to the difficulties encountered in negotiating the connections between lived experience, particularly the lived experience of the poor and the excluded, and theories of politics, of epistemology, and of history. If you look at the history of educational theory, you go back to Montaigne, there's always been a tension, what the people go through in real life and what we report to our students in lecture rooms. There's a disjuncture there. Something happens, something is elided in the process. We must make sure that theory paradigms capture very immediately the immediacies of lived experience, particularly the experience of poor people. Now, how do we go from here? And this is my final statement. In South Africa, we have been overexposed to Western science, to Western technology. We have imbibed too much of Western epistemology. We've gone to Kant, to the Enlightenment. We've gone back there, and we must accept that the Western science and technology have benefited mankind tremendously, particularly in the exploitation of natural resources. But Western epistemology lacked a moral dimension, tended to redefine and reinforce differences, and to impose Western forms of thought and practice on other on other civilizations. This is a large statement. Are there authoritative texts in each of these systems we can use to guide our research? Are there? There are in Western science. There are in Indian philosophy, I know. There are. But most of those texts at times fail to capture the wisdom contained in proverbs, in idioms, in folk tales, in legends. We must go there also, particularly in African discourse. What in African and Indian intellectual traditions and the impulses of people on the ground can be harnessed for inclusive growth? I'm talking of the impulses of people, because at times when you come to India, you want to study what the Indian philosophers think, Indian scholars. But at times, that doesn't capture the impulses on the ground that drive people's actions. Let's find a methodology to penetrate that level of lived experience, and so reconnect our discourse with the immediacies of daily life, as experienced by ordinary people in South Africa, by ordinary people and excluded. The truth has long been known and has been the bond of the people in their anti-colonial and post-colonial struggles in India and in South Africa, and in much of South America, by the way. Nobody can say we have not been won. From the birth of our liberation movements and their handmaiden, the congresses. Here in India, there are congresses there that were used as instruments for the revolution. It is clear that a just society depends absolutely on inclusive democratic processes and institutions. In bringing in the discourses of ordinary people, the lay public, so to speak, the inclusive, participatory, and deliberative model helps to remind us that public decision process always take place within a configuration of power, and that the task of the knowledge elite, you and me, is to dialectically engage the existing political, social, and economic forces, rather than merely reproduce them as we tend to do. Towards this end, the objectives of inclusive participation is to create political and linguistic spaces within democratic deliberative structures that offer a place for public reasoning. This widening of political and intellectual horizons is a precondition for thinking the forms of our engagement across all borders. It is necessary to reconceptualize the historical context of the South Africa-India relations, the logic of their articulation, the nature of the socio-political entities resulting from them, and the ground for trans-territorial, multivocal deliberations and research. The central thrust here grows out of the historical struggles for freedom in our two countries. Their roots are in Mahatma Gandhi and Mandela, in whom freedom was the precondition for the achievement of the true meaning of freedom. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Nkondo. I think many words of wisdom. Hearing him reminded me of one of my favorite books of all time. There is a shaman in Burkina Faso, Malindo Masone, and one of his works is called The Healing Wisdom of Africa. And I have learned so much from The Healing Wisdom of Africa and African fractals and all those ideas. And I think that is the level at which we have a deeper connection. All the post-colonies, as Professor was mentioning, there seems to be a common condition. And he identified some of the problems, one of which he said was the neoliberal market values. The second he said was individualism, which is closely tied to it. And the third is this oppositional difference. That's a very important phrase that Professor used. And we often, sir, in international relations, in the studies, often posit one state against another, or sometimes one community against another, or one set of forces against another set of forces. And most of our thinking is based on this conflict of these oppositional, the difference, the oppositional difference that you mentioned. But you also suggested that there's a way to overcome it. And what I especially liked was the professor's emphasis on the lived experiences rather than abstract thinking. And again, he is challenging the Western construct of the international relations, which is based on the notion that it's mostly states, and also when we say non-state actors, we mean powerful actors like corporations, maybe terrorist groups, NGOs, which are very organized, the big ones. These are the ones we tend to think are the actors that populate the space of international relations, right? And these are the causers, the movers and the shakers that make history. But what Professor Nkondo is asking us to think is to put the people above all these elite concepts like state and corporation. And then maybe we may be able to bridge these binaries and these oppositions. So I hope you think deeply about, he especially mentioned the Western epistemology and why it is inadequate for bringing the post-colonies together. So indeed, if you see the literature of the South-South cooperation, it transcends the Western constructs and the Western assumptions of this opposition and of the state-centric understanding. So I hope that we've all thought about this, and when you do your theories and you reflect about it in class and take up case studies, this notion of the conflict between different forces is almost inevitable, and perhaps it comes from Marxism especially, which by the way is a European, is a Eurocentric theory in itself. Professor talked about the African traditional thought and the Indian traditional thought, which is quite different from the Eurocentric one. So while many of us in the liberation struggles use the Marxist or a neo-Marxist constructs as a way to fight the oppressors or the oppressive structures, he's also asking us to transcend this Marxism, because that itself is inadequate, because it continues the notion that there is a permanent conflict going on, a struggle going on, and a fight going on between different interest groups. So it's in a way he's asking us to reimagine the very foundations of international relations. And I think it's a very big task, because most of us take for granted that there are 3-4 major theories and theoretical bases, and then we base our arguments out of those, one of those, which we prefer, based on our value system. But he's asking for a rethinking of the epistemology itself. So it's a big task, and I hope the students think about it. Let me open up for some questions, please. Any thoughts from any one of you? You want to address it to Professor Nkondo? Yes, Professor Sudarshan, the Dean of a Public Policy School, is here. Sir, you will need a mic. Udhar pahuncha denge, please. Pankaj, because he won't be audible.
Thank you very much. It was a very inspiring talk, and as Sri has said, what we're calling for is a major revolution in epistemology. Not simply in terms of international relations, but in fact most of the subjects. And I think you're pointing to a very fundamental division in terms of how we perceive ourselves in Africa or India or China, and how the West perceives the individual self after what you might call the Enlightenment or the Kantian revolution. There the self is an individuated self. It's an autonomous self that is meant to be its own legislator, as it were, to use a Kantian phrase. Whereas our idea of the self is all in terms of relationships with other people. We are always somebody's, part of some village or part of some community, someone's son, someone's daughter, someone's husband, someone's friend. So our self as a fundamental idea is relational, whereas the Western idea is there is some self and all other things that are purely contingent circumstances that can be peeled away as if they are layers of the onion, and then there will remain some core self after you've removed these ascriptive parts of our understanding of who we are. So I think this fundamental insight, unfortunately, all the epistemology of the textbooks, beginning with economics and its construct of the rational man, the individual maximizing utility, as well as in sociology and politics and all the other disciplines that have come from the West, which have intellectually colonized us. So your call is for an intellectual decolonization, which is a major task, but I think we should be in it because we must derive some collective strength from doing it. It's not as if one university can plow a lonely furrow in that direction. But if we form a kind of a group, the West is very good at doing it. You have the Vienna Circle, you have the Frankfurter School, you have the public choice theorists of the United States. Their strength comes from banding together as intellectuals and pushing the viewpoint. And I think the time has come for us, and your visit here is very opportune, to form that kind of a core group that pursues an agenda with a very clear point. And therefore the emphasis on Satyagraha or Ubuntu is absolutely vital, because that is, I think, the way forward. Otherwise, we would be, everyone is cynical. Democracy and elections and so on will be arouse cynicism in people, and that is because certain core values and a grasp of that in terms of our political leadership as well is missing. So I want to say we're very grateful that you came and delivered the kind of lecture that you did, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Do you want to come?
Yes.
You can sit and...
No. Thank you. Thanks very much for the warm comment. Just want to make one statement, and I'm happy that we have students here. I thought it was staff only. Thanks very much. Edward Said, I'm sure you know him, in his book, Orientalism, his opening line there says, for the West, Africa and Asia are just a career. If you look at all the anthropology, all the sociology of Africa and Asia as an articulation of Western desire, then you realize how distorted, our scholarship is. You see, and I think look very particularly if you read it with that book by Jürgen Habermas called Human Interest. If you look at what you know about the anthropology of Indian customs, the way it's articulated and categorized as really a distortion to serve British interest. If you think about that in those terms, then you know that we have a great challenge to refurbish our perception, to renew the way we see ourselves and how we see the world. There's now gender violence in South Africa and India. Incredible acts of violence. If you look very deeply there, is the inability of men to recognize gender difference as complementary and not negative. To be able to say that to be female is to be human in a different way, and that the female is really an extension of being masculine. You can go through that anthropology and accept that and translate it into our policies. There's where. I serve on the curriculum committees of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, where there's a very strong Indian presence, historically. And we have come out with a curriculum that says, whenever we identify problems in real life, particularly among the poor Indians, the poor Africans, they're excluded from public life. The tendency is to go to school, to Freud, to Karl Marx, to Kant, to Emerson, to go there to say, how can we solve our problems? There's an obsession, the kind of, Eurocentric epistemology, and a deep-seated distrust of African and Indian science. Our cognitive processes have been so colonized. Now we are saying whenever you find a problem in South Africa, particularly where there's a strong Indian presence in KwaZulu-Natal province, start by saying, okay, there's a problem, perhaps it is food security. Here's food security. What can we learn from Western agricultural forms? What kind of farm science can we use? Beyond that says, what can we learn from Indian science, from Indian agriculture, forms of thinking, forms of breeding? And then don't complete your research until you ask the question, what can we learn from indigenous African systems? So we'll come across with the triple heritage approach to problem solving so as to emancipate us from Western hegemony. That's a very practical way of doing. I always tell a story. Let me just tell a story to be graphic. I share a birthday with a cousin. She got married to a polygamous family at the age of 17. She was in a marriage for 3 months and ran mad, as we say in South Africa, ran berserk. My father and my mother, who were very churchy, very Presbyterian, took her to a Western mental clinic. She was there for 3 months. She came back, went back to a polygamous marriage. She ran mad again. A serious relapse. And then my mother said, and I couldn't believe it, why can't we take your cousin to that old lady down the village? I couldn't believe my mother was so Christian and so westernized, could suggest that. We took my cousin there. That was over 40 years ago. In 3 weeks, she came back home, sane, went back to her marriage. 40 years later, she has kids and grandkids. No relapse. Don't reduce African or Indian psychiatry into superstition, into nebulous metaphysics. There's real science there. There's real logic there. That's what I'm trying to say. So when you have a problem, don't just be occupied with going to Kant and to get Heidegger. Don't ask those questions, but move beyond Heidegger and say, what about the Indian philosophy? What about the Indian thought systems? What about African epistemology? That's the message. That's the curriculum of the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we're running out of time, but I think the point is very well taken that the demonization of the traditional knowledge systems as a voodoo or as a witchcraft. This has happened especially in Africa, and many of us have adopted these notions of modernity, and we continue to look down upon what was good in our ancient and medieval past. So I think it's time to reclaim that. That's the way to really stand up. I think Bob Marley's entire reggae philosophy was based on that. Some of you are into music, you will recall. It's a decolonization, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. So that's very important, and I hope that all of you think about any question from students before we need to vacate the venue. It seems there's some class coming up. Yes, please. A short one, please, directed to Professor. Yeah.
So my question was based on how do you think the concept of development has just been a bluff by the global north to create and recreate the global south in the South African region?
The concept of development.
The bluff of development was created by the West.
Oh, yeah.
Points to perpetuate the difference between North and South. This economic development is a solution.
I wish we had a whole day here together. I think that really raises a very profound question. You know, I used to be an English major before I degenerated into politics. And we used to be concerned with how we use English, how we can manipulate English grammar and English syntax, preoccupied with correctness and accuracy and structure and coherence. That's how we learned English. But now I'm becoming disturbed that we should spend more time studying how English uses us. Not how we use English, but how we use us, how it controls and distorts our perceptions of the world. For instance, if you go to the complete Oxford English Dictionary, and then you look at the word Orientalism, it's really a British distortion of the Asian experience. If you look at most of the concepts, particularly on human relations, they are colored by a colonial epistemology, an anthropology that distorts the Western thinking about our world. That's a very, very profound. Not how we use English, but how English uses us to perpetuate and extend the Western interests. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I think it's a very profound talk you gave today, and I hope our students think at the deeper level about the theories and the paradigms which inform our understanding of the world. Professor is asking us to rethink the basics and the assumptions of most of these theories and paradigms. So in a way, he's asking you to go a little abstract, but at the same time connect to what he calls the lived experiences of people, our people, the common people of the global south. So I hope our students will rise to the occasion and think differently and apply these when we look at especially the relations between among the developing countries, but of course also South-North relations. So let's, I don't want to use the deconstructive phrase because that itself, he comes out of one of the critical Western theories, but let us rethink and reimagine all these concepts. So that's a big message, and we are profoundly grateful to Professor Nkondo, to High Commission of South Africa. Frankly, I want to tell our students, in case you don't realize it, the High Commissioner of South Africa is one of the most sought after diplomats in Delhi, who has so many engagements, and it's in fact very difficult to get her time. The fact that she gave more than half a day to come personally and spend time with us, interact with faculty. We have one more engagement in the afternoon after lunch. It's a tremendous thing, and we believe that this relationship can only go forward. We want to thank Her Excellency for the personal leadership should please give her a big hand